Imagine sitting inside a stark, windowless interrogation room, staring at a man who looks completely broken. He is wearing his pajamas, his hair is disheveled, and tears are streaming down his face. He is a first-time father. For the last hour, he has been weeping, clutching his hands and pouring his heart out to homicide detectives about how much he loves his 4-month-old twin baby girls. He looks directly into the eyes of the investigator and says, "I don't want to hurt my babies. I love them so much. I legitimately care more. I knew them for a day, and I'd do anything in the world for them." It is a deeply moving, deeply painful display of raw human grief. To anyone watching this tape, this man isn't a criminal. He is an overstressed, exhausted young father who just experienced every parent's absolute worst nightmare: a freak, split-second domestic accident during a routine diaper change. But watch the detective sitting across from him. The detective doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't lean back. Instead, he slowly reaches into a manila folder, pulls out a single printed photograph, and slides it face up across the metallic table. In that exact millisecond, the entire room goes completely cold. The frantic weeping stops. The trembling hands freeze. The performative grief vanishes into a heavy, suffocating silence. Because that single photograph didn't just show a piece of nursery furniture, it proved that the elaborate, highly detailed story this father had been spinning for hours was a mechanical, physical impossibility. Before this sudden, terrifying pivot inside the interrogation room, the town of Harlan Township, Ohio, was waking up to a tragedy that seemed straightforward. On November 4th, 2024, a frantic 911 call brought paramedics rushing to a suburban home. Inside, 4-month-old baby Evelyn was limp, colorless, and gasping for air. Her father, Andrew Cammar, was alone with the twins, while his fiancée, Danielle Rudy, was miles away at her morning shift in Dayton. To the first responders, Andrew's panic felt entirely genuine. He walked them through the steps of his morning with the precision of a man desperately trying to figure out where things went wrong. He explained how the twins were preemies, how they suffered from intense acid reflux, and how little Evelyn would go completely rigid and arch her back to fight the pain. He claimed he turned around for just 1 second to grab a dropped pacifier, and in that brief flash of time, the baby launched herself off the changing table, hitting the floor before he could catch her. It was a narrative built on high emotional realism. It was filled with mundane, relatable details: the unzipping of a sleeper jumper, the bouncing of a plastic pacifier on the floor, the frantic chest compressions on the living room sofa. It was designed to make the police feel an intense wave of sympathy for an overstressed parent who just made a terrible mistake. And for a while, it worked. Welcome to Time with X. If you are new to the channel, you know we don't just recap the headlines. We dissect the hidden mechanics of deception and look for the exact moment the human mask violently fractures. If you are ready to see how a masterclass in psychological manipulation completely implodes, hit that subscribe button right now, because the web this father wove was about to trap more than just himself. As detectives began looking closer at the layout of that nursery, they realized they weren't dealing with a tragic mishap. The changing table wasn't a flat surface a baby could easily roll off of. It was curved like a half-pipe, constructed specifically to keep an infant safely nested in the center. But that was just the first fracture in his story. The detectives were hiding a massive piece of asymmetric information. They didn't just have a photo of the changing table. They had something else, a hidden detail discovered during the initial sweep of the home that turned this investigation from a tragic accident into a dark, multi-layered domestic horror story. And the most terrifying part? Andrew's fiancée, Danielle, was currently sitting in an adjacent room, fiercely defending him to another team of investigators, completely unaware that a grand jury was already preparing a trap that would violently snap shut on both of them. What did the doctors find that completely destroyed the changing table alibi? What was the hidden anomaly inside that house that the police discovered? And how did a mother who wasn't even home when the incident occurred end up facing a massive criminal indictment alongside the man she trusted. The psychological chess match had just reached its turning point, and the truth behind baby Evelyn's final hours was about to leave the entire community paralyzed with shock. To truly understand how a deception of this magnitude is engineered, we have to rewind to the immediate aftermath of that frantic 911 call. When the first patrol cars pulled up to the rural residence in Warren County, the atmosphere was thick with adrenaline and panic. First responders found Andrew Cammar in a state of visible, hyperventilating distress. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't evasive. In fact, he was the exact opposite. He was highly cooperative, offering an overwhelming deluge of context, medical history, and structural details about his morning routine. Psychologists recognize this tactic as information flooding. When a deceptive individual is under immense scrutiny, their instinct is often not to withhold details, but to manufacture an excess of truth-seeming data. They provide an abundance of real, verifiable, mundane facts to cloak the single, horrific lie hidden at the center of the narrative. Andrew began walking the initial responding officers through a highly structured timeline. He explained that his fiancée, Danielle, had left the home early that morning to commute to her job. He was left alone with their 4-month-old premature twin daughters, Evelyn and her sister. He painted a vivid portrait of the profound exhaustion that comes with raising premature infants. He spoke extensively about their feeding schedules, their persistent crying, and specifically, their severe struggles with infant acid reflux. Listen closely to how he framed the physical vulnerability of his daughter to the investigators during his initial statements. Notice the strategic language choices embedded within his explanation. He used highly descriptive, specialized medical terms like acid reflux and rigid arching to establish himself as an attentive, educated caregiver. By blaming a biological reflex inherent to the child, he was subtly shifting the cause of the incident away from his own actions and onto an unpredictable, uncontrollable physical symptom. He claimed that the baby's body acted like a compressed spring. When she arched her back against the surface of the changing table, the force supposedly propelled her over the edge. He detailed his own frantic reflex, the desperate split-second stretch to catch her, the sensation of the fleece fabric slipping through his fingertips, and the sickening sound of the infant striking the hard floor of the nursery. To make this alibi airtight, Andrew didn't stop at the fall. He spent the next 20 minutes describing his performative panic in the minutes that followed. He told officers how he scooped up the limp infant, carried her to the living room sofa, and began administering desperate single-finger chest compressions while screaming into his phone for emergency dispatcher. He described his overwhelming fear, stating openly that he was petrified to even hold his daughters sometimes because they felt so fragile. This is a masterfully crafted sympathy loop. By admitting to a general sense of anxiety and physical insecurity around the babies, he was attempting to pre-program the investigators to view any subsequent physical anomalies as the result of clumsy, stressed-out negligence rather than calculated, malicious violence. He was actively pleading guilty to the lesser social crime of being an overwhelmed, incompetent first-time father in order to escape the ultimate consequence of intentional homicide. Leave a comment below. When you listen to a suspect provide this level of hyper-specific detail about dropped pacifiers and the texture of baby clothing, does your intuition flag it as genuine panic, or does it feel like a rehearsed script designed to cover up a darker reality? We see these narrative patterns constantly on Time with X, and history shows that the more defensive detail a suspect volunteer before they are even accused, the more calculated the underlying deception usually is. For the first few hours of the medical crisis, as baby Evelyn was rushed to a specialized trauma center in Cincinnati, the medical staff and local police treated the situation with the delicate care reserved for a devastating domestic accident. Andrew remained the picture of a grieving, shattered parent, waiting by the phone, wringing his hands, and projecting an aura of total devastation. But while Andrew was busy solidifying his narrative with the patrol officers, a specialized forensic evidence technician was quietly stepping into the nursery to document the scene. They pulled out a digital camera, set up a tripod, and began taking high-resolution measurements of the changing table, the floor clearance, and the surrounding walls. And it was during this routine processing that the entire geometric foundation of Andrew Cammar's Alibi completely dissolved. The technician didn't find a standard, flat wooden changing pad where a rigid baby could theoretically slide or roll off an edge. What they found instead was an entirely different piece of engineering, a physical layout that transformed Andrew's highly descriptive acid reflux launch story into an outright mechanical impossibility. But the detectives didn't confront him immediately. They let him keep talking. They let him repeat the story on audio. They let him lock himself into the specific physics of his lie, because they knew that the moment they sat him down in the official interrogation box, they would be holding an undeniable piece of physical reality that would completely sever his connection to freedom. As the clock ticked into the late afternoon, the phone in the interrogation wing rang. The medical team from the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit had finished their initial internal scans of baby Evelyn. The detective picked up the receiver, listened in silence for 2 full minutes, and slowly hung up the phone. The case was no longer an accident. It was now an active homicide investigation, and the trap was officially set. The atmosphere inside an interrogation room undergoes a violent chemical shift the moment the investigators stop treating a suspect like a grieving victim and start treating them like an apex adversary. When the lead detective walked back into the room holding the manila folder, he didn't sit down with an expression of sympathy. He sat down with the cold, calculated posture of a chess player about to deliver checkmate. Andrew Cammar was still performing. He was wiping his eyes, sniffing, and lamenting the fragile health of his twin girls. He was entirely unaware that the narrative landscape beneath his feet had completely shifted. The detective leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and began asking Andrew to repeat the exact mechanics of the fall one more time. This is a standard forensic interview technique known as cognitive anchoring. By forcing the deceptive subject to reiterate the precise details of their lie immediately before presenting the contradictory evidence, the investigator eliminates any potential escape route. The suspect cannot claim they misspoke, nor can they alter their timeline to fit the newly revealed facts. Like I said, she was right there on the pad. I turned to get the pacifier, she arched up, and she just went over the side. It happened so fast, she hit the floor right next to the table legs. Okay. Andrew, look at this. The guys went out and took some photos of the nursery layout, and they sent me this picture of your changing table. Walk me through how that works, because when I look at this photo, the table surface is completely concave. It's built like a half pipe. The sides curve upward significantly, designed specifically to prevent a baby from rolling or sliding off, even if they move violently. So, looking at this design, how does a 4-month-old infant launch themselves up and over an elevated curved barrier from a dead stop? If you look at the video frames of this exact moment, you can observe the precise millisecond the psychological mask undergoes a structural failure. The vocal cords constrict. The rapid, performative weeping stops instantly, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed paralysis. His brain is suddenly forced to process a massive cognitive overload. He had spent hours perfecting the emotional delivery of his story, but he had completely failed to account for the simple, unyielding geometry of the nursery furniture. A 4-month-old infant does not possess the muscular architecture, the leverage, or the physical mass required to generate enough upward trajectory to clear a concave, raised-edge changing barrier. The physics were absolute. The baby could not have rolled off, she could not have slid off, she could not have launched herself. The only way baby Evelyn could have cleared that curved wood was if she was manually lifted, forcefully extracted, or violently thrown. Andrew stared at the photograph. His lips parted, but no sound came out for several agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice completely lost its high-pitched emotional timbre. It dropped into a flat, monotone murmur, the sound of an ego trying frantically to recalculate its survival strategy in real time. I mean, I don't know. Maybe she didn't clear it. Maybe when I reached out to grab her, maybe my arm accidentally pushed her further? I was panicking. Everything was a blur. I might have knocked her off myself while trying to save her. Notice the immediate narrative retreat. The moment the primary lie is dismantled by physical reality, the deceptive mind instantly defaults to a secondary, defensive perimeter. He is no longer blaming the baby's acid reflux. He is now reframing the violence as a clumsy, accidental consequence of his own panicked rescue attempt. He is trying to merge the undeniable force required to clear the table with his established persona of an anxious, well-meaning father. But the detective wasn't done sliding documents across the table. The changing table photograph was merely the entry point of the trap. The investigator leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper. He pulled out the preliminary emergency room medical brief from the Cincinnati Trauma Center. "Andrew, the changing table is only part of the problem. I just got off the phone with the pediatric intensive care specialists. They've done the internal imaging. A simple fall from a changing table onto a carpeted floor produces very specific low-velocity impact injuries, usually a linear skull fracture at worst. But that is not what is going on inside your daughter's body. Evelyn has a severely lacerated, shattered liver. She has catastrophic internal bleeding in her abdominal cavity. She has deep spinal trauma and severe retinal hemorrhaging. The doctors flatly stated that these injuries are completely inconsistent with a short domestic fall. They are indicative of massive high-impact blunt force trauma and violent abusive acceleration-deceleration forces. This wasn't a slip, Andrew. Someone inflicted severe concentrated violence on that little girl. The presentation of this asymmetric medical data is a devastating psychological blow. Andrew is suddenly forced to realize that the police aren't just looking at the room, they are looking inside the very body of his child. The lacerated liver is the definitive forensic anchor. A baby's liver is deeply protected within the thoracic cage. It requires immense, focused, compressing force, such as a high-speed vehicle collision or a direct, violent blow from an adult hand, to shatter. If this breakdown of forensic deception is keeping you locked into the screen, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Time with X. Your support allows us to continue dissecting these complex interrogations with the clinical depth they deserve. Faced with the reality of his daughter's internal destruction, Andrew's composure began to suffer a complete systemic collapse. He didn't offer a logical medical counter-explanation. Instead, he began to physically withdraw, pulling his knees up toward his chest on the interrogation chair, rocking back and forth and crying out for his fiancée. "Dude, I'm so scared. I mean, Danielle, they're going to send me to jail. I swear I didn't mean to do anything. I love my babies so much. You have to let me see Danielle." But as Andrew rocked back and forth, crying out for the mother of his children to protect him, he was entirely oblivious to the fact that across the hallway, inside an identical, isolated room, Danielle Rudy was currently sitting under the bright lights of a separate interview. And what she was telling investigators in that adjacent room was about to send a massive shockwave through the entire architecture of this case, unwittingly setting off a secondary narrative detonation that would alter the legal fate of both parents forever. When a multi-layered domestic crime unfolds, investigators will almost always deploy a strategy known as parallel isolation. By separating a couple immediately and interviewing them simultaneously, detectives prevent them from aligning their stories, reading each other's body language, or establishing a unified front. While Andrew was unraveling under the weight of geometry and medicine, Danielle Rudy was sitting across from a different team of detectives, operating under a completely different psychological paradigm. Danielle was not acting like a suspicious suspect. She was acting as Andrew Cammar's most ferocious defender. She was an emotional wall, standing firmly between her fiancé and the building homicide investigation. When detectives asked her about the environment inside the home, about how Andrew handled the extreme, unrelenting pressure of caring for premature twins alone, her responses were fiercely protective. She validated his character, downplayed his volatile anxiety, and insisted that their home was an oasis of safety. "I 100% believe he would say something if anything happened. I still feel like they're safe with him. He loves those girls more than anything. He's just stressed because they cry a lot and have the reflux, but he would never, ever hurt them. I trust him completely." To the audience watching this unfold, This creates a profound, almost sickening wave of cognitive dissonance. We, the viewers, possess asymmetric information. We have already seen the concave changing table. We have already heard the medical report detailing a shattered liver and internal bleeding. Watching a mother sit in a police station and use her own voice to guarantee the safety of a man who had just structurally destroyed her infant daughter is a deeply disturbing psychological phenomenon. The detectives listened patiently to her defense. They allowed her to fully commit to her position. They let her repeat, multiple times on tape, that she had absolutely no concerns about Andrew's behavior, that she noticed no red flags in the home, and that she entirely believed his account of the diaper table accident. Why did they let her do this? Because in the realm of criminal law, establishing a person's awareness of risk is critical. By forcing Danielle to repeatedly state that she believed the children were completely safe and that Andrew was a flawless caregiver, she was inadvertently closing her own legal escape hatches. She was stripping away her future defense of, "I knew he was dangerous. I was just too terrified to speak up." Once she had firmly locked herself into her defensive stance, the detective sitting across from her shifted his tone. He reached into his folder and pulled out a second medical brief, one that didn't involve the dying baby, Evelyn, at all. It involved her surviving twin sister. "Danielle, I need you to listen to me very carefully. While the trauma team was working on Evelyn, because these girls are twins and they live in the same environment, the hospital performed a full-body skeletal survey on the surviving twin sister. They just got the x-rays back. Danielle, the surviving twin has multiple posterior rib fractures. They are in various stages of healing. Some recent, but some are weeks old. These are highly specific injuries caused by an adult placing their hands around an infant's chest and squeezing with immense, crushing force. You are her mother. You live in that house. How did your surviving daughter get multiple broken ribs over the last month without you noticing?" This is the moment the entire structural integrity of the defense completely collapses. The revelation of the surviving twins' historic injuries completely changes the legal calculus of the case. This wasn't a single, isolated flash of catastrophic anger on November 4th. This was evidence of a sustained, hidden pattern of domestic torture occurring inside that nursery for weeks. The psychological reaction from Danielle was immediate and profound. The fierce, defensive shield vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. She didn't look angry at the detectives. She looked like a person who had suddenly realized they were sharing a bed with a monster. But as the realization of what had been happening while she was away at work began to sink in, the detective dropped the final, devastating legal realization onto the table. If those broken ribs were weeks old, it meant that the surviving baby had been living in agony for a month. It meant that every time she was picked up, every time her diaper was changed, those fractured bones were grinding together. And as a mother, as a legal guardian, Danielle had a strict statutory duty to protect her children from obvious physical trauma. By failing to notice, failing to act, and actively defending the environment, she was no longer just a grieving witness. She was now a criminal target. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Do you believe a mother living in a small suburban home could truly be completely oblivious to multiple broken ribs on a 4-month-old infant? Or does her fierce defense of Andrew suggest she was actively covering up the reality of their household? This exact question would soon divide an entire grand jury as the case careened toward a shocking, unprecedented legal conclusion. On November 6, 2024, 2 days after entering the hospital, little baby Evelyn's neurological activity ceased entirely. She succumbed to her catastrophic internal injuries, and her death was officially ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the abdomen and head. The community watched in mourning, expecting the legal system to swiftly and singularly destroy Andrew Cammar, and it did. A grand jury initially returned an indictment against Andrew for murder, felonious assault, and endangering children. The performative tears, the frantic explanations of acid reflux, and the hyper-detailed accounts of dropped pacifiers had completely failed to withstand the unyielding scrutiny of forensic science. He was locked behind bars, his mask permanently shattered. facing the reality of spending the rest of his natural life inside a maximum security penitentiary. But the wheels of justice were not done spinning. True crime documentaries usually end the moment the handcuffs slap onto the killer's wrists. But this case possessed a final, devastating narrative reversal that would leave the entire region paralyzed with shock. 1 month after the death of her daughter, after her initial stance as Andrew's absolute defender had been recorded on police tape, Danielle Rudy was summoned before a Warren County grand jury. The prosecutors laid out the timeline of the home. They presented the evidence of the concave changing table, the shattered liver of Evelyn, and most importantly, the healing, weeks-old broken ribs of the surviving twin sister. The grand jury came to a chilling, unanimous conclusion. A parent cannot simply claim ignorance when systemic, structural violence is occurring beneath their own roof. In the eyes of the law, turning a blind eye to the torture of your children is just as criminal as delivering the blows yourself. The gavel fell with absolute finality. The grand jury issued a sweeping indictment turning directly on the mother, charging Danielle Rudy with felony child endangering and complicity. Both parents, who had started that crisp November morning operating as a unified domestic unit, were now locked in separate cells, facing the absolute collapse of their lives. The legal resolution was swift and merciless. Andrew Cammar, realizing that his forensic alibi was dead and his nursery physics were an impossibility, accepted a plea deal to avoid a potential life sentence. The judge sentenced him to an aggregate term of 19 to 24 years in prison for his monstrous acts of violence. Moments later, Danielle Rudy stood before the same bench, her hands shaking as the sentence was read aloud. For her failure to protect her daughters, for her decision to act as an emotional shield for a killer rather than a guardian for her infants, she was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The case of Andrew Cammar and Danielle Rudy leaves us with a terrifying, lingering question about the limits of human perception. It forces us to confront the reality that the most horrific monsters don't look like monsters. They look like tired, anxious, hyper-cooperative fathers wearing pajamas in an interrogation room, weeping over how much they love their babies. They look like normal people, right up until the exact millisecond the forensic photograph is placed on the table, and the mask completely slips away. Thank you for spending your time with X. If this deep psychological dissection kept you locked to your screen until the very last sentence, make sure your subscription is active, share this video with someone who loves true crime analytics, and click directly on the video appearing on your screen right now to step inside our next case. The next mask is already beginning to crack.